Well, hello, welcome everybody that's coming into our Zoom today. If you are here for the post-settlement talk that we did at the T3 Leadership Summit a few weeks ago, then you're showing up for the right webinar. We have a lot of people that registered for this, so we're going to give just a moment for people to make it from the waiting room into the stream. And I'll do an introduction of my co-presenter today in just a moment. But those of you that are new to this group, if this is your first webinar with this series, we've been running a broker and team leadership series at T360 for I think about a year now. We typically host a call or Zoom like this at least once a month on topical issues for real estate leadership. The session today was presented live at the T3 Summit just about 3 weeks ago in Scottsdale, Arizona. And I know I talked to a few people who are coming today who were actually at the live presentation, are coming back or bringing their management team or some of the folks from their offices into the Zoom, said, hey, this is one of the things that I heard at Leadership Summit that we may want to hear a second time with maybe a little bit more time today. So I think we're getting everybody into the Zoom. It looks like the live stream over in LinkedIn is going, so or is just about to kick off. So I'm going to go ahead and get us started. So again, welcome. My name is Jack Miller. I'm the president and CEO of T360. We are a management consulting and research firm in residential real estate. It's a 25-year-old company. We have about 35 full-time people that do residential real estate brokerage consulting and advisory work. We have about 250 clients currently, and we work in brokerage, MLS, technology, association, and do a little bit of advisory work for companies investing in the space. We have been very close to the NAR settlement with many of our clients that are brokers working through this. I think we've worked with about 40 brokerages that have been looking at their buyer brokerage practices over the last year. That led to some of the content in the talk you're about to hear. I would like to introduce, and it's my great pleasure to introduce, Ed Zorn. Ed Zorn is the General Counsel for CRMLS, the large MLS in California, either the first or the second largest MLS in the United States. It kind of depends on who you talk to. And also a long-term thinker on all of the policy surrounding the NAR settlement. Ed has been a contributor to our Swanepoel Trends report for several years. Has been one of the people out of the kind of legal side of the business that we've been talking to about the implications of the class action lawsuits. Has been a great contributor in some of our reports and thinking and analysis of these class action lawsuits and the possible changes in the industry. Ed, you've got a lot of other experience in terms of residential and commercial and a few other things. So I'm going to kick it over to you just to do a quick introduction of yourself and a little bit of background so people know, we say attorney and everybody tries to put you in a box. Right. But I don't think that's your only box. And I think that's part of what makes your thinking so novel.
Yeah, it isn't my only box, but it is the box I started off in more than 30 years ago. And I actually started off my career in real estate as a plaintiff's trial attorney, where we did large-scale construction defect. I did some class actions, lots of disclosure issues. So I have courtroom experience. And then I went out and got tired of that. Didn't want to spend my life away from family, just in the courtroom. And so I started my own brokerage company. And so I have been a licensed broker for over 20 years as a realtor, and operated my own small company. Spun that into a scenario where I managed 3 offices in one of the large franchisor systems, local offices in Southern California on the commercial side. And then also spent a lot of time representing as a lawyer, developers, contractors, as well as brokerage firms. I wrote the policy handbooks, did lots of training on contracts and processes, combining the marketing with the legal on that. And then found myself, having the opportunity and privilege to working for the California Regional Multiple Listing Service, the largest MLS in the country, and combining a lot of those skills kind of together. So I found myself kind of a little bit uniquely positioned in commenting over the last few years in the litigation, things that have happened kind of through that, in combining those legal and brokerage. And I still do deals today as a broker, where I live in Knoxville, Tennessee. I've closed 40 transactions in the last 3 years, representing buyers. So I'm still out in showing properties in living rooms, doing deals. And so I try to bring some of that experience to these conversations.
Yeah, it's really, I think it's so important because a lot of the mechanics we're going to talk about are right in the things that brokers and agents are doing every day in working with buyers and sellers. And just so the group understands, you've worked with both like significantly residential and commercial on as a broker, so that it gives you a different perspective.
Yeah, I received my CCIM designation, which is the highest designation of the commercial practitioner, in 2006. So quite a few years ago, and I still do, again, invest in and do some commercial work as well.
Got it. Yeah, great. Okay, perfect. Well, this presentation that we gave at the T3 Summit, we talked about, this session was titled Establishing a New Normal. So I'm going to flip over into some slides, and then we are just going to run through those. And I'm going to ask Ed to comment on these as we do that, and then we'll just have a discussion. I'm hoping to leave about 10 minutes at the end for some Q&A, which we know there will be Q&A. There's always Q&A on this topic, and we got some at T3 Summit. There's some that we're already kind of loaded up to prepare to answer. So where we are in the industry is with the NAR settlement practice changes. Everyone in the next 120 days is in the process of trying to establish what is the new normal for their company. How are they going to operate? Philosophically, where does it come from? How are we interpreting the rules into practice? And it isn't just the practice, it's also the forms. It's also, what are we doing with listing marketing? Are we making changes to our websites? Or what's going in our buyer presentations? What's going in our seller presentations? And what do those consultations look like? So this was put together to kind of explicate the new versus the old way of doing business. And so we're going to talk first a little bit about the new way of doing business that is described via an interpretation of the rules in the settlement agreement. And I think Ed and I both worked on, like, how do we distill what's in the settlement agreement into a way of operating that makes sense. I also think it would be important to mention there's some other, besides the settlement agreement, we've also been pointing people to reading the Department of Justice's commentary, their statement of interest in the MLS PIN case. And I would say if you're a broker, leader, a real estate leader, read the settlement agreement and all the practice changes, especially, but also go read the Department of Justice's commentary in the MLS PIN case, because it describes some of the underlying philosophy around the consumer forward way of thinking. So with that, let's just jump in. Let's talk about what Ed and I have named or called the consumer-centric model. So Ed, why don't you take us through the elements of the consumer-centric model?
Yeah, so the consumer-centric model with regard to how you function as a broker really has the couple of key elements on it. The first, if we start on the buyer side, that's different in the consumer-centric model, is that the buyer broker now has the opportunity to set their fees and services that they're going to work with the buyer directly. In this model, as opposed to the old one of sharing, now I, as a buyer's broker, I get to call my own shot. I get to set the fee based on my expertise. Look, I'm a 30-year lawyer, 20-year realtor, got thousands of transactions under my belt. Shouldn't I get a different rate than the person who just got through real estate school last month and is doing their first deal, right? The current system doesn't factor that in. And so this is really a key element of the consumer advocates, the DOJ, the plaintiffs saying, look, buyers should get to negotiate and set the fee based on the skill sets and the expertise of the buyer broker that they're working with. And so now under this new consumer-centric model, that's what's going to happen, because we have this new rule that says before you ever show a property, go through a tour, you need to have this conversation with what your fee is going to be and get that set up. And the great news about the new model here, Jack, is that it's mandated. Everybody's going to have to do this. Yep. So the big problem before was if I try to do it with a buyer and try to negotiate a fee, but they could go to you and just go into a house friction-free, it made it difficult for us to have that conversation. Well, that big problem has now been taken away because we're all going to have to do this. And then
that mandate of we all need to do it kind of puts everyone on the same playing field. It's like we're not struggling to adopt a practice in some places and others are just not adopting it. We all have to do it.
Right. And everyone forever has said it's a great practice. Everybody should do it, but no one did it because of the competition. Right. So this it puts everybody on the same playing field. Then the other thing that's a really key aspect of the consumer-centric model is what happens on the listing side. Right. So think about this. If you remove the concept of commission sharing and you realize, look, the buyer's agent is going to deal with that with their own buyer to set a fee. I don't have to deal with that anymore on the listing side. So my presentation now on the listing side is going to be just about my services, how I market, how good I am, the valuation services I bring. And I set a fee that's easier to explain to a seller that is just the fee that you're hiring me to represent your home. Now, at the same time, I'm going to acknowledge in that conversation that it is on our best interest if the buyer has representation. It will make the transaction go smoother, more likely to get closed on time with a professional on the other side. And those are expensive, and that a buyer may very likely need help financing the fee that the buyer's going to pay to the buyer's agent. And we can accommodate that on the listing side by wrapping that fee up as part of the transaction. It goes to the last section here on the consumer-centric model, in that the purchase agreement now will govern the distribution of the fee that goes to the buyer. So a simple sentence is all you need, right? If I'm a buyer's agent, then all I need to say is seller will pay at Zorn Realty X% of the purchase price at closing. By doing that, we alleviate all kinds of problems. It's simple, it's straightforward. I get paid just like I do today directly from the seller, right? And everything operates smoothly with lending and everything else. So that's kind of a little summary of how the consumer-centric model works. That's quite a bit easier than the one we have now.
Yeah. And then, so I think you hit a little bit of this, but let's talk about what are the pros for the consumer-centric model. What are the things that are advantageous?
Yeah, I think the first one, right, where we talk about transparency, right now, everybody knows, both the listing side and the seller knows how much they're paying to have their property marketed. And the buyer now, for the first time, really gets involved in the setting of the fee. And I, as a buyer's agent, have lots more opportunity. I don't have to work for whatever some listing agent decided to leave me on the table, right? I get to set my fee based on my expertise. Also, the representational boundaries are much more solidified. The buyer knows I'm there for the buyer because the buyer is the one who's setting that fee and is agreeing to the services that we set. So there's actually some opportunity there too to maybe offer some lower services and different things that were maybe more difficult under the old model. And the value that I bring and that I can articulate now means I can command the kind of price that is commensurate with my skill set, all on the front end. So the minute I open the front door, no matter what door I open, I know exactly how much I'm going to make as a buyer's agent. It's not going to be dictated to one person's offering X and someone else is X minus 2%, right? None of that matters to me. I don't care what property we look at. I get paid the same no matter what.
Yeah, yeah, and that is one of the challenges, I think, in the broker sharing model, is that because the buyer broker has been incumbent on somebody else negotiating their value and fee for them. So that's unusual. There's very few service businesses where you say, I'm going to do something and I'm not sure what I'm going to be paid for this service, but I'm obligated to do it. And then it ends up in uncomfortable situations, even prior to this settlement, where if people aren't offering anything, then you're not, and you don't have a buyer representation agreement in place or a buyer agreement in place, then you're stuck. Now you're really stuck. You may do work that you don't get paid for, and that's a common complaint. I pulled up a slide that's later in the presentation that I just thought is relevant to now, which Redfin did a study recently, and there have been many studies of this to determine what, I think this is part of the problem, Ed. We have buyers that don't understand. The buyers are bringing the money. They're taking out the biggest loan they've ever taken out. They're buying the biggest thing they've ever purchased. And more than a quarter of them have no idea how their agent was paid. And a significant portion of them have some idea, but are really not certain. So it's a large number. Like, I think that if you're making a large purchase, I think it's unacceptable that you would not understand how the purchase is being paid for. And by the way, side eyes looking at healthcare industry, you guys need to work on that. But this industry, I think we can know this on the front end. And
another interesting question here would be, who decided how much money your buyer agent would get?
Correct.
I would be interested to see if the buyers recognize, well, wait a minute, it wasn't me, so it must have been somebody else, right? So that would have been another interesting question.
Yeah, that'd be another good question to add to that. So let's talk about some of the cons of this consumer-centric model, because the industry right now, I think, is in a reactive mode about this new way of doing business. And so they're coming up with a lot of I don't like. This is I think the summary you and I talked about So let's talk about these for just a second. I think number one is probably the biggest one that we're experiencing currently.
Yeah, and number one, short-term confusion about, how does a buyer agent get paid? This is going to be the one that hits everybody for their first one or two transactions, right?
Yeah.
And then it goes away, right? So that confusion is not hard. Basically, what's going to happen, guys, on the buy side, you're going to set your fee with your buyer up front before you see a property. And then you're simply going to include that fee in an offer. And it becomes part of the negotiation like any other term, just like it would be if you were asking for a repair or you have a client that needs help with title and escrow fees. So you wrap that in. If the seller says, I don't want to pay that, no problem, then we adjust price. And you look at your comps and CMAs to help justify the value that you're bringing in comparison to what happened on other transactions, right? So this will just be part of the process. I think, Jack, what those of us who do commercial, we're very used to this. There is no MLS, there is no guarantee or offer of compensation. We have to do it all, and part of the transaction. And you get used to how this works. And once you do a couple transactions, I think this kind of ends up going away.
Yeah, yeah. The other two, I put question marks behind because as agents with less value to the consumer may have a hard time.
Yep.
But I put question mark, is that really a problem? Like if you can't explain your value, then that's a deeper issue than these industry compensation changes. If you don't have a buyer that has accepted your services and what those services cost, like that's a real problem. And I think if agents are not capable of doing that, then they're probably problematic anyway, where that's like, I'm depending on, if you as an agent, I'm depending on a listing agent who's really good at their job to negotiate for my compensation. That's a long-term problem. That's a deeper issue.
Yeah. And as a high value agent, trust me, that's not a con. That's a plus.
Yeah. And then the last one I'll put in here, which is I've heard this, and I think the media is not helping with this, to say like, hey, we're not going to have to pay for the buy side anymore. We're not going to do that. I have a perspective on this. I'm interested to hear yours because my perspective comes a little bit different, but I'm interested in your perspective on that.
Yeah, what I tell people when they say, well, what happens if a seller doesn't want to offer concessions or offer to help finance the buyer side of the commission by putting into the transaction? My answer is, well, what do you do today? Right? We've been saying for years in the MLS space, organized real estate, that a seller does not have to offer compensation to the buy side. Every MLS now takes zero. Right now it's CRMLS. We have 100 listings with zero offer of compensation. So what do you do today? Right? There's no requirement that compensation be made at all. Right? So that's not a settlement issue. I think it just brings it more into the fruition. So again, I think it's more perception than anything else. And again, it's just a function of price. So you can just negotiate it like anything else. So it's really not that big of a deal.
Yeah. My answer is if you think this completely flummoxes the market and it's permanent and forever, then what you're telling me is you don't believe in the free market.
Right, that's true.
Right. You're saying you don't believe in the free market, and you're saying you don't believe that sellers actually really do want to sell their home. Because if they really want to sell their home, we know, and you and I know, the industry knows, that first-time home buyers and many move-up buyers, they do not have the extra free cash to pay their agent. They just don't have it. They don't have it. Given the interest rates, given the prices of homes today, they don't have the money. And the seller is going to be in the same. They're in this situation today, by the way. This is not a new situation. This is a current situation where if there aren't funds to contribute into the transaction to make it happen, then it just doesn't happen. And I believe in the free market. I believe that sellers will say, look, I want to get this deal done. I need to sell my home for whatever reason. I need to sell my home. There's a reason I'm putting it on the market. And I'm just looking at what am I going to net out of this. And if the buyer says, look, I can pay a little bit more, but I need these concessions in order to do the deal, I can finance it. All the lending rules have said that it's okay. They're okay with the financing it in the current structure that we've been doing it, but it has to come through as a seller concession. And I believe the free market. So
let me give you some data to support your free market analysis. I'm going to go back to 2019, pre-pandemic. Still, if you remember back, guys, in 2019, it was still a solid seller's market, right? Things were still going off the market pretty quick. At CRMLS, I went back and looked. We capture concessions that were actually paid on a closed listing. Okay. 41%, 65,000 deals in 2019 had a concession having nothing to do with compensation, right? This is the seller paying title, escrow, right?
Contributing.
Repairs of some kind to help what you just said, get their deal done, right? 65,000 of those, 41% in a seller's market, right? So again, I do believe in the market system that this particular potential con, I don't think will really be long-lived or surface too high.
Yeah. Because sellers are going to run up against the same thing. I'm trying to sell a property that's really a first-time home buyer type of property. Guess what? Those people are going to need, they're going to need your help. Yeah. And you're going to, and by the way, that's not any different than what you were doing prior to this settlement anyway, right? It's the same thing. All right. So let's talk a little bit about the old way, which is, I think people here are familiar with. So we'll jump into that one for a minute. So key elements of the broker sharing model. Take us through this, and I'll add some comments on it as well.
Yeah, it's the one everyone's familiar with, right? That the listing broker and seller pick what amount the buyer agent's going to get. It's guaranteed in the MLS, right? Remember, the broker and sharing model had some benefits to it on the consumer side because of the transparency, right? It was the people knew what was happening because of the multiple listing service rules. The issue here is we are now removing, in my opinion, anything that was a potential benefit around that model was all around the MLS, the security, the guarantee, that you can't change it in the middle of a transaction, right? The arbitration process to get paid, the transparency, all of that's going away.
Yeah. And that's what happens after. Here it says July. I think they moved the date to September or August now.
August actually is most of your MLSs will be making these changes either in the middle of August up to the middle of September. Sometime in that month is when your individual MLS will probably be changing.
Yeah, and you can continue to offer broker side compensation, but it's not guaranteed unless you have it. You have to get it all in writing anyway. So there's no, if you go put it in your marketing, put it on your website, it's all pending what comes in on the offer. And the seller can say, well, this is well below my list price. I'm not comfortable with that, and then it goes away. So there's no guarantees there.
Yeah, so there's lots of transparency issues, lots of fair housing issues that come up with that. And again, why? I keep coming back to why share? It's more complicated, it's more paperwork, it's more confusing. Why didn't you just do the consumer-centric model? It's easier.
Yeah, for sure. So some pros, I think we just talked a little bit about here. I'll say that right now, the challenge is agents understand how the old model works. And what I'm mostly witnessing, Ed, in conversation I'm having with some exceptions, but for the most part, right now, brokers and agents are trying to figure out how to keep doing it the old way.
Yes.
They're like doing all these workarounds, but we just made it, there's no guarantee. It won't be in the MLS. You can put it on your private marketing, but it's not guaranteed if it's on your private marketing. Still has to be written into an agreement between the brokers or between the, related to the purchase agreement. So still has to be agreed to in writing by all parties. So we've created all this resistance around being able to do it, which, and now you're calling everybody before you show every home to find out if there's anything offered. So it's now become very challenging to do it. The buyer, now let's put this as a pro, the buyer doesn't have to understand the services and fees for the agent to get paid, but I'm not convinced that's a good thing. I think that's part of the problem. We could call it a pro, like, I'm going to get paid for my services, but if your buyer still doesn't understand, the person, by the way, bringing all the money and the big loan and making all the commitments doesn't understand how you got paid, I contend that's a problem, and that's part of the problem that got us to where we are today, is that, and it's, by the way, part of the problem why we have buyer side compensation class action lawsuits is because they're saying they didn't understand it, right? It didn't make sense to them, and that they may be overpaid for their home because of that, right? And there's other downstream consequences for that. And then here I put the third one, currently, but not in the near future, meaning the August-September timeframe. The buyer agent compensation is determined by the listing broker, not for the value of buyer agent. It's a little bit what we're saying, like the listing brokers, again, in the sharing model, is determining what the buyer agent services are worth, not the consumer. It's really it's another, you have a friend over at a brokerage firm A determining what is going to be paid for services supplied to a third party at brokerage firm B, and that's sticky, right? That's part of why we are where we are today. So,
and I think one of the pros that would happen there is that and it kind of rolls into the cons that we're going to talk
Yeah.
about too,
Yeah.
is right, again, as a high value agent, you making it sticky and easy for a super low value agent to compete,
Yeah.
that's not a pro to me.
Yeah. Yeah. You're propping up somebody that has less skill,
Right.
and maybe isn't providing the services, isn't
Right.
providing the level of services, or doesn't have the history of providing those level of services to a client. And so and when we're propping them up by setting their compensation to whatever we think it should be on the list side, on listing broker side. So yeah, so the cons, I think the cons here, we think broadly, I mean, T360 has been writing about these laws since 2018, that, and based on, again, if you've not read the DOJ statement of interest in the MLS Penn case, MLS Penn no select, go read that. Just type in DOJ statement of interest, MLS Penn. It's a PDF. It's very well written. It's actually, I think it was written for the industry. I think DOJ wrote it for us.
Yes.
Yeah, go read it. It's very well put together. Based on our reading of it, my interpretation is if the industry continues to have broker sharing as the core, the main way that we do business, that we are not out of the woods with DOJ, and we're probably not out of the woods with litigation risk in terms of people being able to say this is a problem. Right.
I would agree. Right. And I think you got a couple of slides to kind of support the continued liability risk on that. And I think then it just, the cons kind of keep falling here on broker sharing, right? Do we really want our consumers to not have transparency, right? That's not a good thing. Again, especially if you're a good high value agent, you want your consumer to know what's happening. You want them involved in the process so they can then refer you more business because they understand your competency level. 3 is interesting to me because I used to teach at a local association. I started a commercial committee where I trained residential agents on how to do commercial transactions. And about 50% of the people who would come to my classes have already done some commercial work. And I always ask this question: put your hand up if you've done a commercial transaction. About 50% of the hands go up. And I said, keep your hand up if the first transaction you did as a buyer's agent, you got paid 0. And every class I ever did, I had at least one, most of the time 2 people who would keep that hand up going, oh yeah, I just called, they told me it was a certain amount. I thought it was like residential. I get to the closing table and they're all grinning going, yeah, welcome to your most expensive lesson you're ever going to learn. You just got nothing. And so that's going to happen, right? With people don't realize, people who are used to the current model, making a phone call, hey, this is what you're sharing, cool, let me go write an offer in and do the transaction. If you don't follow that up and get a written confirmation, a separate agreement, there's a chance you may not get paid as a buyer's agent.
Yeah, 100%. Yeah. And I think also the insecure buyer agent compensation that exists today in the form of, there are people that put 0 in the compensation field today. And, you know, they're like, well, then what do you do? Right. So there's many in the industry already been struggling, or they put less than the value of your services. I mean, that's the other part of it is, if you are in a well-established agent, you've done thousands of transactions, you're very good at your job, and somebody offers you a low number, well, your services are worth more. You've got the experience, the knowledge, you're providing more value. You shouldn't be dictated by that. But I find the people that are worse at this are the experienced agents. They go, I'll just do another deal and move on. Where, you know, like you're leaving money on the table based on your level of knowledge and experience. So, and then you said it earlier, said this supports the low value buyer agent at the expense of the high value agent.
Yeah, the number of sales is a fixed pie, guys. It's not going up. There's only so many sales that are going to happen in your neighborhood. And if every one of those sales that goes to that low value buyer agent means that's a high value buyer agent that didn't get that deal.
Yeah. So I do want to talk about the continued risk, because I think that's a real factor. And again, read the DOJ statement of interest on MLS Penn. Go read it. So this statement is problematic because of the risk it creates around a threat of steering. So if in the listing appointment, people continue to say, if you don't offer buyer agent compensation, no one will show your home.
This is the crux of the claim. The fear of steering, even if steering never happens, that's irrelevant. It's the fear of steering that the listing agents can convey to a seller, that if you don't hit a certain number, the exposure is going to be reduced. If we create a system where that continues, guys, expect another round of this 2 or 3 years from now.
Yeah, it'll keep happening because it looks like from the legal perspective, from the DOJ's perspective, and from the consumer's perspective that are in these lawsuits, that they are being threatened if they don't offer a certain amount in their listing, right? That's the threat. And this is and Ed, you had me pull this in. I think this is very salient. This is straight from the statement of interest. As long as sellers can make buyer broker commission offers, they will continue to offer customary commissions out of fear that buyer brokers will direct buyers away from listings with lower commissions, a well-documented phenomenon known as steering. And that's one of kind of a key paragraph within their commentary. So,
and it's important too, guys, right? That's from the Department of Justice. And the Department of Justice recently prevailed on an appeal against NAR, where there was previously a few years ago a settlement that limited some of the investigations that the DOJ could do into this subject. The DOJ won that appeal and is now free to expand on the investigation of these practices. So this is a great snapshot of what they think, right? And they think the problem is broker sharing. That is the heart and the reason that there is problems. So why share? You don't need it, right? That's kind of the theme of what they want to happen. Just stop sharing. Stop sharing commissions.
Stop sharing broker commission. Yeah. You can get everything accomplished with a seller concession that you need to get accomplished, but the seller concession is more transparent to the buyer, more transparent to the seller. You can market the seller concession. You're allowed to put it in the MLS, and the MLSs that support it. It sounds like some MLSs are going to be supporting it. So that's or at least being able to say they're open to seller concessions in the listing if they're not going to support an amount. So that's the piece there. The challenge, and I put this in here, part of the challenge is, and this is from NAR survey, that a lot of agents also are not accustomed to getting this written agreement, especially not up front. Here, we've hovered around 40% of agents get some kind of written buyer agency or buyer representation agreement, depending on how I recognize there's some transaction broker states here where don't do agency a lot. Get that. Looking at you, Florida. They get some kind of written agreement. I will say in many cases, when I've talked to people, said, well, when does that agreement actually get signed? And they're like, oh, I turned it in with the purchase agreement after I've seen what compensation is offered on the listing my buyer is making an offer on. We don't sign it. So I'd say probably the vast, now this is probably, I don't know this for sure, but based on the conversations I've had with people, it's like, yeah, it gets turned in at the same time as the purchase agreement when we already know all the financial details versus upfront. So I think even the 40% that are getting an agreement signed is probably the timing of that agreement is likely problematic in a significant percentage of that. Then we have some that are oral agreements, which we know how well those do. We have, again, about a third of the market says no, and then a percentage says don't know, which I've got a real question for people.
That's a high number for I don't know.
It's a high number for I don't know if I get an agreement signed up front or not. I think some of them may be confused with their state disclosure. Like, oh, I get them to sign a disclosure. Like in Texas, we require that. I think Tennessee has that. I think a number of states have that where you have to sign a disclosure. And it's not a representation agreement, it's just a disclosure. So that's it. So let's talk about industry risks. We've definitely delved into those in terms of some litigation risk. These, we believe, when we presented this at our T3 Summit, these risks will continue if we continue the broker sharing model. We'll have a Wild West environment for buyer agent compensation.
Yeah.
The compensation before, as Ed said, was enforced by the MLS. We had a very good system in the sense that the MLS, if you put it in there, that field is tracked, it's historical. Right now, if you're doing broker to broker compensation, you go put it on your website, you can literally go change it on the website, and there's no recourse there. There's no, the buyer agent submits an offer and says, well, I took the number from your website. And the listing broker says, well, we changed it this morning, and what you thought it was is not what it is today. And so there's no enforcement there, and it creates some real challenges there. The next lawsuit targets, we believe, are going to be vendors and associations with the standardized forms. And this one's tricky, Ed. This one deserves some airtime. Talk to us about the forms and why the forms are a risk and what you think that looks like.
Yeah, this is a risk, so this is not certain, right?
Yeah, it's a risk.
But what happens if the forms, especially if you're in a state where the state association or whoever provides the forms dominates, and 95% of agents use a single listing agreement form, And what if that form now maintains commission sharing as its way of how it gets paid? Maybe they add another option, but let's be honest, right? If the purpose of the form of keeping commission sharing is to make it easy, have a little friction as possible, not change things too much on agents, if that's the purpose, right? And the result is the few slides back where we talked about if you're in someone's living room and someone utters the words, if you don't put at least X in the when someone calls me to share, if I don't say X%, then they won't show your home. If those kinds of words are still flowing in listing presentations, then we are right back where we are before. It's just the focus won't be on the MLS and the offer of compensation in the MLS. It will be on the fact that you put 20 horizontal competitors in a room to design a form that 95% of the marketplace uses that keeps the same commission sharing. And you just saw a slide from what the DOJ thinks of commission sharing, right? Alive and well. And so that's now, the question becomes, will there be enough agents who break away from commission sharing to do the consumer-centric model that I think what will happen, actually, Jack, is that people who do the consumer-centric model will capture market share and listings away from people who do commission sharing, because it's just frankly easier to explain. It's simpler. I'm going in with half the number of what my sharing partner, competitor is trying to do. So, but there needs to be at least a big enough group to start that conversation for the commission sharing group to lose deals before it'll change. So that's where that risk comes.
Yeah. I think you said something very important, which is you're like, there's a market force there, whereas as a listing agent or listing broker, if you're saying, look, here's what you're going to pay me, and we're going to see what offers come in and what they ask for to pay as a concession, we're going to judge that, which that number could be a lot less than what the other brokers in the market are going to charge you. They're still trying to do this commission sharing thing. It could be half, it could be more than half. Right? It's just it lets you say, look, you're just paying me for my services. We're going to let the buyer's agent negotiate a seller concession to pay for their services, and we're going to see what comes in and do what's best for you, right? That sells your home and that is financially the best outcome, the best transaction, the best terms, whatever that is. And so that's a little easier. That's the easier conversation with the seller, where I think listing brokers are paying attention. Hello, if you're awake.
Right.
That's the strategic opportunity actually to embrace the consumer model.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah.
Definitely.
Is it simpler? And I put this when I said we get to keep the perception of steering and conflicts of interest. We do have a person that commented and said, well, steering is BS. Everybody can see online. And which, by the way, I agree with that. If you go look at the Bright MLS study, if you go look at that, all the steering stuff that was used as reference in the lawsuit were pre-2010, I think. We're pretty old.
Yeah.
Right, they're pretty old.
The studies the economists are using are kind of a joke. I agree. There's either minimal steering or no steering. That's my position. It doesn't matter. It's not steering. It's the fear of steering.
The threat. It's the threat.
Right.
If you don't offer this much, via on your listing to compensate the other broker, it's that threat. That's the problem. So those of you that are hung up on the steering component, it isn't that steering has to happen for this to be bad. It's the threat of steering, which the DOJ and the claimants in these lawsuits are saying is keeping prices propped up, they think, artificially. I think you guys are worth every penny, right? Every penny. I've sold homes. I worked in a brokerage. I ran a brokerage, and I know you guys are worth it, right? But the consumer and the DOJ looks at that and said, if you're using this threat of steering to elevate or hold up buyer compensation for the agent, then that's a problem. So it isn't the steering itself. So that's very good. I pulled this in, Ed, this was all you. You said this is where you go back to about practice changes. Talk to us about this part of the Code of Ethics.
So the beginning of every year, I always read the preamble to the NAR Code of Ethics. It's a great inspirational thing. It's your year start off great as a realtor, as a real estate practitioner. And when I did it this year, I came across this paragraph, right, which really hit home to me with what the industry is going through, right? And that's right, that as a realtor, right, we're supposed to affirmatively identify and take steps through enforcement of the Code of Ethics and assisting regulatory bodies, DOJ, who has an opinion on something, right? To eliminate practices which may damage, doesn't say will damage, it says may damage the public or which might discredit or bring dishonor to the real estate profession, right? And I would suggest to you the concept of commission sharing between brokers is such an element. We don't need it. The consumer doesn't need it at all off the MLS. You've stripped it of its benefits once you took it off the MLS. So let's just not do it. And
Right.
let's just embrace the consumer-centric model and move on with a better perspective in
Yeah.
the eyes of the regulators and of the consumers that we serve.
I want to come to some defense of the industry in buyer representation just for a moment from a historical perspective, because I do not believe, Ed, that this industry conspired against the consumer in setting up the MLS and the compensation sharing and the commission sharing that we were doing before. I don't believe that. My belief is, and this is based on historical what happened, when buyer representation became a thing in the 90s, which grew out of sub-agency, which was how it was done before. In sub-agency, and this is again a little history lesson, in sub-agency, everybody works for the seller, including the buyer's agent. They're all working for the seller. I think the industry said, hey, that's a problem. They made a change. The industry made a change and advocated for buyer representation. Said, we want the buyer to be clearly representing their client and negotiating on their benefit. And that's where buyer representation and buyer agency really came from, became a practice in the 90s. The problem is we kept the financial structure of sub-agency, where
Exactly.
we kept the financial structure sub-agency, which is where the conflict now is, because now the buyers are unaware of what their agent is paid. They don't know it's negotiable. And then now we have listing agents using the threat of steering potentially to keep pricing at a certain level within their markets, right? So that's the problem. So, but I think the industry was trying to do its very best for the buyer in saying, look, you should have representation. The DOJ in their statement of interest, they say they want buyers to have representation, right? So it isn't a knock against buyer representation. I don't even think it's a knock against the industry's good intentions of having buyers properly represented. The problem was we left the old compensation model from sub-agency in place with a new way where the buyer's agent is working for the buyer, right? So
I think that's an excellent representation and commentary on what that is. I think that's exactly what happened, right? Hindsight being 2020. We should have changed the way the money flowed back in the 90s. We didn't. So here we are. So now let's change it.
Yeah, I think if in the 90s, when they made that change, if they said you have to sign a form and have to disclose fees, you have to make it all up front, and everybody did it, all got on board and did all of that, we'd probably be in a different world today from a litigation perspective.
Definitely.
But that's not what happened. That's not what happened. And now we need to transition to that. So I think that, but it is a good example of a time when people operating to the benefit of the consumer said, we're going to make an industry change. This is another time like that where we can make that change. So here's what needs to happen. So we came up with a little summary of what needs to happen. We need to leverage the marketing of seller concessions when appropriate for your seller client. So transitioning to that as a principal mechanism, saying there's concessions available in this home to help a first-time home buyer, a VA buyer, a move up, anybody, if you're a listing agent and you are selling a property where you believe or know, because your market experience, that the buyer of that property is going to need concessions, consult with your seller and say, I think we should market, concessions are available. It can be just to say, hey, there's concessions available, there's no dollar attached to it. To say concessions are available, send in your offer and we'll look at it. You could put a dollar on it if it's important. You could decide, hey, it's better marketing if we put a percentage or a dollar amount and say there's, for a full priced offer, we have some concessions available. And again, it's still the seller's in control of their side of the transaction. They get to look at the offer and terms in the purchase agreement and decide whether they want to do it or not. So it's consumer friendly, right? So still, it's good, right?
And even if and as a buyer's agent, right? Because I get this question a lot, what happens if there is no concession or willingness? I don't care. Every single offer I put in from this day forward is going to say, seller to pay at Zorn Realty X% for the purchase price at closing. So even if it's not communicated, doesn't change what I'm going to do as a buyer's agent. I'm still asking for it. And then we will make it part of the negotiation. And I will use, again, a CMA and the documentation and information out of the multiple listing service on comparable properties to justify why the price that we offered, which includes payment to me as a buyer's agent, is consistent and proper in light of what the comparables say.
And I think this is your familiarity with how business is done in commercial, because it's done that way every single day in commercial all day long, where you're very comfortable with that. We have a lot of residential agents and brokers on this Zoom that are not, right? They've not done that. The point, and I would say, and the other question we get, we've actually got a question in the comments about like, hey, what about, should the buyer says, well, I don't want to see anybody I don't want to see a listing that's not offering seller compensation. I would say as a good buyer's agent, what you'd say is, look, we don't know the conversation that seller had with their listing agent. We should not try to read the minds of those folks. We should go look, if this is the home of your dreams, of something you want to look at, it's got a nice big backyard, it's got all the things you want, we should go look at it, and we should write our best offer for them. We should submit it, and we should ask for the concessions that you need to close this deal, whether that's my compensation, point buy downs, cost of close, insurance, whatever it is, whatever you need, right? We're going to ask for that. And then we'll get a negotiation with them, because let's not take inventory off the table, and let's have that conversation. Because again, don't try to read the minds and the conversation that you were not participative in between the listing agent and their seller. You don't know.
Correct. That's the exact right advice, right? I'm going to show every single property. I'm going to write an offer on any property my buyer wants to buy.
Yep. There you go. That's it. The forms piece. Let's talk about that. So we talked a little bit about it. This is what we're advising, we believe needs to happen.
I think the big thing, and this is part of the settlement agreement, right? That the sellers need to be giving permission for how compensation is being handled in listing agreements, right? So if an MLS is going to roll out the opportunity to advertise concessions, right? There should be something in the listing agreement, in the standardized forms, that support the disclosure and the participation of the seller having that conversation with the listing agent, and that being included in the listing agreement, right? So, hey, I authorize the listing agent to provide X% as a potential concession, or like at CRMLS, we're going to have it just a checkbox also. We're not going to have a number. You don't have to put a number. You can just say seller's willing to consider concessions made in an offer, right? So just a way to communicate to the buying community that this conversation has happened, there's an understanding and a willingness to do that. And so the more that is in the forms, the better. The forms really drive practice changes. So if we really want to drive a change in the practice, you do that through MLS input and forms. That's how practice changes change. That's so I would advocate get rid of commission sharing in the form. It serves no purpose. Just get rid of it. And have your form focus only on the fee that the seller is going to pay to the listing agent to represent the seller, and have a section about explaining concessions and why they matter and those kind of things, and move on.
Yeah. And I know there's some people that have been on this call. They're probably serving on a forms committee right now, and they're having a meltdown. But that's what we're to tell you. This is a full move into working the consumer way. If we straddle the fence, guys, as an industry, if we straddle the fence and try to do everything, it's messy. And I'm looking at some forms coming out of association forms committees that have been shared with me from some of our work. I'm looking at some of them, and they're trying to do both things. And they are the most confusing things I've ever seen in real estate. I'm not sure. I wouldn't put them in front of my customer. I don't think Ed would either. And try to
let me tell you how confusing. I sent one to Jack, said, hey, Jack, what's your opinion? He gave me, by the way, you're in one camp. There's a simple fact pattern that's going to happen all the time. I gave it so far, Jack, to 11 people. I have 11 people who think the fee should be X, which is one number, and 5 people who say it's X plus 1%. This is amount that should be going just to the listing agent. So there's literally a split, almost 50-50, of what the listing agent's going to get off of this form document. That's not what should be happening.
No, that's super confusing. And I'll just come, the form, it looks like a tax form to me. Like you need a calculator to figure out what the actual finance, and I think that's confusing. Let's not do that, consumer. Let's pick away and let's go with that. If you sit on the fence in the middle and you're trying to do both, I'm just telling you, it's going to be painful, difficult. It's not going to work. Agents are going to hate the forms because they're hard to explain. Consumers are not going to sign the forms because they don't understand them, and it puts us at litigation risk. Other elements, obviously we need to train people in a new way. People need to be sharp on their value propositions. That's good. There's some opportunities here. Brokerages creating their own listing and buyer agreements that are simplified. If the forms committees are going to produce complex, difficult to explain forms that try to do everything under the sun, and continue with broker sharing, that brokerages can just create their own and say, look, we're gonna move down our own path, and we're gonna create forms that are easier for the consumer. And those, again, brokerage leaders, if you're listening, that's part of your opportunity with making a full move into the consumer-centric model, is you can make your listing conversation simpler, you can make your buyer conversation simpler, you can make the whole everything simpler. And that's the opportunity if the associations don't get it there, which is possible.
Yeah, and keep in mind too, this is easy to do on listing and buyer rep agreements because it doesn't involve other practitioners that you're cooperating with. Right. Now, this is different for a purchase agreement.
Purchase agreement.
Because everybody has to explain the purchase agreement to their individual clients, and there's a huge benefit in using a form that everyone understands how it's structured. But when you're talking about a listing agreement, it doesn't matter, Jack, that you and I have different listing agreements. I can explain mine just as well, right?
Yeah.
There's no necessarily benefit in it being a form listing agreement.
Yeah. It's good. There's some risks. I think the risks we talked about, I'll go through these quickly. We end up with forms that keep trying to do the broker compensation sharing, and it just got more. We created a lot of friction to that way of doing business by taking out of the MLS, and a lot of the benefits and advantages, as Ed stated so well. We have this risk too, and this is what the question you sent me, that quiz you sent me of where you had people go one way or the other, was basically this. If more compensation is offered via the broker sharing, but I as a buyer agent sign an agreement at a lower price, then we're gonna have a lot of buyer agents that go back to their client and say, hey, these guys are offering to pay more. Can I get more? Which is, I think, Ed, you used an expletive when I asked about that.
Yeah, I'm like, seriously, guys, who here has paid a lawyer or a CPA to do, like, let's say you paid your CPA to do your taxes, and he delivered the taxes exactly like he said he would, and he comes in and hands you a bill that's 30% more than what you agreed to for him to do exactly what he said he was going to do for the other price. None of you would pay that. Like, when people say, well, how do I get that money? I'm shocked that they would ask. Why don't you guys ask for a referral, right? Instead, right?
Yeah.
You agree to pay for a certain, you agree to work for a certain percent, be happy you got that percent. And if there's money on the table from the seller's perspective, how can that go to the buyer's hand? How can
give it to the buyer? Give it to the person bringing all the money to the transaction.
Work it into your deal in a good way for your buyer, and then ask for a referral. But the thought that you'd go back to a buyer and ask for more fee, it blows my mind that someone would even think that's a thing.
Yeah, it's greedy thinking. It's not good. It's greedy thinking. Last we put on here, conspiracy risks and litigation are worse now. So think about this. Via the settlement agreement, DOJ watches this all happen. The compensation field comes out of the MLS, and the entire industry reorganizes around the one practice that DOJ has said they do not want, right? And now they say, well, look, you took the conspiracy out of if there is a conspiracy, you took it out of the MLS, you put it into the forms to continue that practice that we think is problematic because of the threat of steering. And you then all started putting it all on your websites.
Right. You should know better, right? Like, that's even harder to defend.
What is that? That's worse. That's worse. That's many individual brokers all kind of doing the same practice to continue to support a certain pricing structure and way of dealing with the consumer. That's worse.
That's an easier case. It's an easier plaintiff case.
It's an easier claim. And then who do you name? The brokers that put the compensation sharing on their website. You go on web and you go, look, XYZ broker is offering compensation. Seems like the percentages all line up with what we know the industry standards were. And now you'd name them in a case. So you just put a target on your back. Congratulations. So that's why I'm telling brokers, be careful with succumbing to the agents that are coming to you and saying, I demand to be able to put compensation on the website for I'm saying, be careful. Because what you're doing is you're opening a very particular door that puts a target on your back, right? So be careful, be thoughtful about it. And I think talk to your lawyer. If you think about it, you'll likely arrive at the same conclusions that Ed and I have. So, guys, we got a few minutes left. I wanted to make one offer known. We've got some other things that we're doing with people, and then Ed and I are going to take a few questions. I see a few in the chat. So, Ed, if you want to read through, pick a few that we can answer. We are going to handle. I'm going to skip a couple of slides here because we got lots. I will give a takeaway. I'll give a takeaway, and then I got an offer. Takeaways here: trust the market and the consumer. Let's not overthink this and try to retain control. The industry's desire to retain control of compensation on the buy side is part of the problem. And if you're saying that we can't have conversation with the consumer where they can value the services, that means you don't believe in the free market, and you're doing something that you don't believe in the market, you don't believe in the free market. And we need to trust the consumer and educate them and trust the market to do its work, right? We need to solve challenges in this. Forms is a big one, practice is a big one, and adopt and work around the new rules. Don't work around them. There's a lot of energy going into workarounds right now. And that is only going to get us in trouble. Only. All right. Last piece I want to give you guys. T360 is going to be hosting a post-settlement workshop in Austin, Texas, for about 100 people. We just decided to do this last week. We've got a room reserved at the Austin Board of Realtors. We've made it very affordable. It's $295. We'll provide a list of hotels and where to go. We've got a full day's agenda. We're going to dig into these topics and give you some materials to take back to your brokerage, your forms committee, whoever you need to talk to, because we think this is a deeper conversation. So we're actually going to do some workshop work. So that's the one offer I'd make you aware of. I would say T360 as a firm is doing a lot of consulting with brokers about how to adopt practices and make changes in their buyer brokerage practices or listing practices. We're happy to help you with those, but this I wanted to be known on a short schedule. We decided to go do it. So I think price will go to $395 after May 31st. If you want to come sign up right now, there's only 100 spots. We're not doing a big thing here. And this is really, we just feel it's important to get people around. So with that, why don't we flip over some questions and take a few before we sign off here. What have you found?
So I think the first one I want to address is a good question, right? Will concessions just become the new target for steering, right? That concessions just, quote, replaces commissions. No, I don't think that'll be the case. And it has to do a little bit with the nature of how the fields are going to be created by the MLSs to comply with the settlement. So the first thing is, number one, guys, remember, concessions are already happening on over 40% of the deals, right? Which has nothing to do with compensation. In CRMLS, I did a search on agent comments and found that 15% of our existing listings have some kind of advertisement for a concession having nothing to do with comp. So this is a field you guys really want and have been using anyway. So I think what you're going to see, Jack, is it's going to be combined. So the way the field is designed is it cannot be limited to only compensation. So let's talk an FHA buyer. If I got an FHA property, a condo, first time, I know when I look at comps that almost every comp that came in on an FHA buyer, the seller not only paid for the commissions for the buyer, but they also paid for title, for escrow, and a percent towards the loan points, right? So now in the concession field, since it's a one single number, the concession's not going to be what the comp offer is. The concession's going to be what I think a good offer is to market a potential compensation and the title fee, the escrow fee, and a loan point. Right. And I think also to the extent that there's an opportunity not to have to put a number, but just the willingness that we want you to include compensation in an offer, but we're not making a commitment, that also will drive steering away. And I think the other thing too is steering is, remember, this is a couple of things working together, not one. People who argue that concessions will just become the new steering, comp field, you're missing the point about buyer representation agreements before a tour happens. Right. This is the problem, honestly, with the commission sharing in the existing forms. What do you do in your sharing model if you agreed to X to share, but the buyer agent comes in and says, I want X minus 1% because my contract was less than that? What do you do with the spread? Right. Your contract in listing agreement has to deal with all of these what ifs. Right. So I think the two things together, concessions on the one hand and combined with buyer representation agreement before a tour, means that it will not be able to be meaningfully used, as a replacement for comp.
Yeah, that's good. Related to that, we had a question come in. What do we say to a seller that doesn't offer any buyer agent compensation when the house is not getting showed and it's not selling? So what would be your answer to that, Ed? That's a good objection.
Your price too high. What do you tell any owner when there's no showings? Right. And so what you do, and this should be part of your listing presentation, every listing presentation should now include an adjustment for compensation in the near term while that's still available. And then it'll eventually move over to, a seller paying a buyer's fee as a concession. Actually, part of part of the discussion of the list price, right? If you want to list a property at $1 million, and as we look at comps, there was multiple different concessions given to help the buyer get into the property, and we average those out to X, then if you're going to say, I'm going to provide no concessions, no comp, I'm not paying for anything, no problem, then we need to drop your list price by X because no other seller got that money either. Right. So that's just
it's a price. It's really it really is a pricing. It really goes straight back to a pricing conversation about the financial transaction and what the effective price is. It's the effective price, not the list price. The effective price with the compensation or the seller concessions factored in. And so I think that's a good way to talk about the effective price versus the list price. So yeah, I think that was a good one. Lots of questions about the lawsuit itself, which I feel like are better addressed by sending people to facts.realtor. So if you have questions about the Q&A from the settlement, what is or isn't allowed.
There's one in here I'd like to address, Jack, about what happens if you remove all reference to the buy side commission from the listing agreement? What happens if you have an unrepresented buyer, right? Because we all know as agents, that unrepresented buyer is a pain to us. It takes time. It takes effort. There's additional risk involved, right? Because they're going to blame you, even though you did everything right. They're still going to blame you if they don't like the house. So I would recommend, and I think what you're going to see in a good listing agreement form would have that dual rate, right? Here's the rate that I represent you for as the seller. If the other side has an agent, if the other side does not have an agent and I have to do more work, then in addition to the fee I get for the basic, I have a premium for dealing with an unrepresented buyer, because that takes more time and energy and skill and risk on my part to work with an unrepresented buyer. So that's how you do that. And if you're going to do a dual agency, if that's allowed in your state, then you don't need that in the contract between you and the seller, because you will have a contract with the buyer. Right. And your fee would be based on what the buyers. Now you would need the proper disclosures for, designated dual agencies and all those things based on what state you're in. Right. But that's an easy issue to deal with.
Yeah, and that's an issue in our consulting work we've been doing with brokers. That's one of the things we keep running into, is interpreting the NAR settlement rules into practices within the agency laws within the state you're in. That's become our team's become very fluent in interpretation of how agency rules impact practice. Now, again, you always have to check with your local attorney, make sure all the I's are dotted, T's are crossed. But as far as practices, that's where that piece comes in. So, I show we have just run over our time. We still have there's still some great questions in here. I would say we will be posting the video to YouTube. So this session will be posted there. If you need access to it, it'll be at T360's YouTube. Please go there, follow, do all the things, and we'll have it up for you to watch as soon as it finishes processing. Ed, I just want to thank you again. You did a tremendous job live in person at the Leadership Summit. I know we could talk for hours on this topic together, and the industry needs more conversation about it. Again, a reminder, we are hosting a workshop for 100 leaders in Austin, Texas, June 11th. You can register now for that, and we'll send you details. If you have questions about it, you can email us, and we'll send you details. There's an agenda that we're going to send out shortly. There's a whole thing. So if your person needs to know all the details of everything before you make a decision, don't worry, that's coming. If your person says, I trust T3 and I want to work on this, just sign up. And we also, again, if you have some specific help you'd like, feel free to reach out. Ed, thank you again for spending the time with us. I deeply appreciate the friendship and the work that you've done on this issue for years for the industry, and how contributive your thinking has been to all of our research and analysis of how these cases impact things. And I hope to see you the next time we do this, which I don't know, might, depending on how this went, you may have some demands for speaking on your schedule, sir. So
no problem. Thanks for the opportunity. It's always a good time getting together.
Okay, great. All right, everybody, we will see you at next month's session. Glad to have all the newcomers that showed up today, and look forward to more. Go out there, help your agents, sell a house, do something great. Talk to you soon. Bye.